Alright, hello everybody, welcome to our next lesson. This is Stalin and Totalitarianism. This is for our unit, or the unit Revolution and Resistance. So our objectives and standards are to analyze how Stalin came to power and to identify the rule for the people in the Soviet Union under Stalin. And please take a moment there to read the standards if you would. And our desired result, how did Stalin rule people and government in the Soviet Union? So Stalin comes to power. In 1922, Lenin is going to suffer a stroke. Now, it's not going to kill him, but it's going to leave him very debilitated. And it's going to make people start thinking about who should rule after Lenin, if Lenin should suddenly die. And Lenin will suffer, I believe, another stroke as well, and also not just he just won't recover from health conditions. So either way, he survives, but like we said, it does bring about the topic of who should rule after Lenin, if he should die. Now, Leon Trotsky, was a leading general in the Soviet Union during the Russian Civil War, and Joseph Stalin, a name we haven't talked about yet, were the top picks for the position. Now, Stalin was well known in the Bolshevik organization, and he rose to become the secretary of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union. Now, Joseph Stalin actually changed his last name to mean what it means, to mean man of steel. Stalin was ruthless. Stalin would do anything he could to get power and to keep power, to keep control. He put his allies in power positions while he was general secretary of the Communist Party to build support for himself in the Communist Party. Now, Lenin actually believed Stalin was dangerous. He believed Stalin was ruthless. He believed Stalin was power hungry. So Lenin really wasn't a huge fan of Stalin. But either way, when Lenin dies 2 years later in 1924, Stalin's kind of in a key spot to take over the government. Stalin was in total control, in terms of the Communist Party by 1928. In 1929, Trotsky will be forced into exile. He will be kicked out of the country, and he will no longer be a threat. So with that said, Joseph Stalin will take control of the Soviet Union for the next 30 years or so, and he's going to rule the Soviet Union with an iron fist. So how did Stalin do this? How did Stalin keep control of the Soviet Union under himself? Well, a government that has complete control over the public and the private lives of its citizens is called totalitarian, and it's a dictatorship. You've probably heard the word dictatorship before, and this is a type of government that Stalin basically creates. Dictators will typically use this threat of controlling their lives and controlling every little bit of society to crush any type of form of opposition. So Stalin really doesn't want people challenging him or his control. And typically, the police are used with enforcing government policy. What this means is that they would spy on citizens, or they would even intimidate citizens, whether this be through violence, threats, destroying their property, whether it be their homes or businesses. So the police were really involved in making sure Stalin was in control. And this is very scary for people. And of course, sometimes violence and murder were used as well. So Stalin used a police state. What that means, he used the police to enforce his policies. Again, the police are going to be used to listen for any opposition. They're going to, try to scare people into, maybe not, forming some type of, rebellious group. So he used his secret police with tanks and armored cars to stop protests against Stalin. And the police actually read mail. They would monitor telephones, and they had spies everywhere. So they would even, kind of walk around the cities and neighborhoods, and, you might think it's an ordinary citizen, but, if you're talking at the bus stop or at the public park about how you don't like Stalin, well, maybe the guy sitting next to you is a police officer, listening to your conversation. So people were really scared and had to be careful what they said and did, because secret police executed and arrested millions of people under Stalin. Removing threats. 1934, Stalin turned against those in the Communist Party. In 1937, Stalin initiated the Great Purge. Many Bolsheviks who had supported revolution were put on trial. They were executed or sent to labor camps. Stalin gained complete control of the country and government. Stalin and his government also controlled the Soviet Union through different means. They controlled newspapers, movies, radio, other sources. Writers, artists, and composers, people who wrote music, were often censored. They weren't allowed to write about things that weren't, maybe necessarily approved by Stalin or discussed by Stalin or anything like that. So there's really no individual creativity. You either fall in line with Stalin and follow the policies of the government, or you find yourself in a labor camp or possibly dead. So that was kind of life in the Soviet Union. The media was specifically used to congratulate the successes of the government. There was no criticizing the government. Like, in our country, we see the news, or, people on the news might criticize the government or the president. Well, in the Soviet Union, that didn't happen. The media was used strictly to support the government. They also used the arts for propaganda, posters, movies, radio broadcasts, music, anything that made Stalin or the communist government look good, you would find in the Soviet Union. Education was another big part of controlling people. So in a totalitarian government, indoctrination is used to tell the people what to think. So to do this, to tell people what to think, how do you do that? Well, you control them through education. So you begin teaching children at a very young age that this is what you should think about Stalin, this is what you think about your country. And education was used to make Stalin look good and policies look good. And this is going to lead to a lot of issues in the Cold War, and a lot of people who grew up in the 1930s or were kids in the 1930s, when they come to be about 20 years old or so, and during the Cold War in the 1950s, when we get to the Cold War, you'll see that a lot of these people who are against the United States were learning as children when they were 7, 8 years old that Stalin was great and communism was great, and to not like the United States. So that's where a lot of this comes from. So children are taught the ideas and the virtues and the importance of communism. Any professor or teacher who questioned these virtues could find themselves either without a job or, again, in prison. Government will also stress the ideas of sacrifice and hard work. So that's the two big parts of the Soviet Union. You must be willing to sacrifice yourself or part of your life or part of your lifestyle for the government, for the country, and you must work hard for the Soviet Union. You have to work hard, whether it be a factory, a doctor, a soldier, whatever. You need to work hard to support the Soviet Union. There were also youth groups that trained these young kids and young teenagers, kids your own age, many are teenagers, to be future party members of the Communist Party. In terms of religion and persecution, a totalitarian government will establish enemies of the state, quote unquote, to place blame on them when things go wrong. It's never the government's fault in a totalitarian government. They always try to blame somebody else. Typically, these are members of religious or different ethnic groups, people who, are minority groups. So Stalin and the government will attack religion and promote the views of atheism. Atheism is a kind of view that doesn't really believe in a higher power, in case you don't know. So Stalin will attack religion and kind of promote atheism throughout the Soviet Union. The Russian Orthodox Church and other religions will become targeted by Stalin and the government. Many synagogues and churches were destroyed, and many religious leaders were either sent to labor camps or killed. Controlling the economy. In 1928, Stalin called for a command economy. What this means is it's a system where the government makes all economic decisions, controls what a factory makes, how much a factory makes, how much people are paid, things like that. And he calls this his 5-year plans, and they were identified on how to develop the economy. Stalin wants high levels of steel, coal, oil, and industry. He wants Russia or the Soviet Union to become a highly industrialized country. Remember, we talked about the Russian country and the Russian people were not very industrialized prior to World War One. So Stalin wants to get get the Soviet Union up to par or up to an equal level with the rest of the world. So to achieve this, he limits production of consumer goods, which led to a lot of problems in housing, clothing, and other basic needs of people. Because he's focusing so much on industry, he's not really focusing on the needs of his people. Another way he impacted people was farm collection. This poster here talks about farm collection and having people support this idea. I'm not sure what it says in Russian there, but either way, that's a poster from this time. Uh, due to, I'm sorry, despite the decline in the basic supplies, the Soviet Union does increase its industry. Stalin also seized over 25 million private farms, and he forms them into collective farms or large government-owned farms. Now, families would work the farms and help produce food for the country. Again, taking some of these private land and private property to be used by the government. Well, this obviously didn't make a lot of people happy, and some peasants actually refused this by either destroying their crops or killing their livestock, but the government still decided to force them to work the farms. One group that was specifically really impacted this was the kulaks. The kulaks were a wealthy group of peasants who were actually murdered for their protest by the government, and the collective farms will actually result in about 5 and 10 million deaths in the Soviet Union due to murder or violence or destruction or even just starvation and hunger, people or illness. People died because they were overworked, they didn't have enough food to go and support themselves. And it's also pretty much known or said that Stalin, when we get to Adolf Hitler, is responsible supposedly for more deaths than Hitler. So Stalin, not really a good guy. Alright, so our closure. How did Stalin rule people and the government in the Soviet Union? Think about some of the control factors we talked about. How did he keep control? What did he do to gain power? How did he treat his people? And that will help you answer your question. Alright guys, have a great rest of your day or night. I'll talk to you soon.